Have you thought what living in the untamed outskirts of the Wild West was like? To stroll in the boots of cattle rustlers, bandits, and trailblazers in a land where disorder and experience remained closely connected. Welcome to the universe of rough scenes, trying adventures, and momentous stories. Today, we're taking you on an unmatched journey to investigate 15 surprising things that occurred in the Wild West. From strange violations to curious traditions, these stories catch the substance of a period loaded up with unusualness and interest. Remain with us as we reveal the mysteries, the legends, and the surprising occasions that characterize the Wild West. Trust me, you won't have any desire to miss even a single moment of this captivating journey. Number 15, Belle the Bandit Queen. Belle, a real-life outlaw, born as Myra Belle Shirley in Missouri, led quite an adventurous life that could have been the plot of a Western movie. Belle's childhood was far from boring. Up until the age of 6, Belle and her family were refugees, living in a shed. They never really wanted the whole fairy tale, nor did they achieve it. They just made the best of it, corrupted by the turbulence of the Civil War that saw their family's farm hijacked and her brother murdered. Her first experience of outlawing was over time she married Jim Reed, an outlaw who loved the vices. Following Jim's death, Belle sank lower into the criminal world. She aligns herself with Sam Starr and his gang that specialized in horse theft and bootlegging. However, her involvement in crime was not a small deal at all. She had numerous times been arrested, but not convicted mainly for horse theft, although she often slipped through the legal loopholes due to weak evidence. Among the major events in Belle's life, the death of her husband, Sam Starr, could be referred to as one of the most tragic. He was shot in a car with gunshots, and Belle found herself in a very vulnerable situation again. Using her tactics, she took a young man, Billy July, as a husband mainly through the stakes of owning a home in Younger's Bend. Thus, this marriage had more to do with strategy rather than romance. Jilly knew her position in the chain of the hostile outlaw group. Belle's life was as brutal as her death. She was attacked and killed at close range with a revolver in the year 1889 when she was returning from home. Theories include her own children being the culprits, which brings more suffering to an already tragic life of the woman. Belle Starr's story is colored with myth and given the romantic gloss by dime novels and later films. Number 14, dentistry on horseback. Picture this, a dusty path loosens up and you hear the jingle of devices with each step of a pony. Riding along isn't simply any explorer, however a roaming tooth puller, a kind of dental specialist riding a horse from hundreds of years past. Those in acute toothache painted the picture of a wandering tooth extractor, a group of businessmen, barbers, blacksmiths, anybody with a set of pliers and a working knowledge of teeth pulling for a shilling or two. To date, there are many people who can be related to frontier dentistry, and among them, the most well-known is Doc Holliday. Having received the degree of Doctor of Dental Surgery at the Pennsylvania College of Dental Surgery, Holliday moved west for gold, but also for his health, suffering from tuberculosis. Gambling consumed much of his time, as did his dentistry practice, and even though the conditions were tough, he was recognized for his skill. Some of the blacksmiths served as semi-official dentists who removed teeth by using their strength and the available tools. Nonetheless, the foregoing realities show that some degree of professional dental care was available. Such dentists as Doc Holliday were the exception, and their services could be considered as the privilege to few people in an environment where even basic techniques and tools were a luxury compared to gouges and other brutal instruments. Number 13, John Wesley Harding. Picture the Western movies with the desert-like frontier town wanted men riding through the night. These were some rather impressive characters, and chief among them rose the reputation of the man called John Wesley Hardin. He was born in 1853 in Bonham, Texas, and it should be noted that Hardin started turning to crime at an early age. During his juvenile crime at the age of 15, he was able to take a life by stabbing a former slave to death due to an altercation. This brutal act made him a pathway to perhaps one of the most brutal outlaws of the Wild West. Hardin's legend grew quickly. In various confrontations, it has been documented that while traveling along the Chisholm Trail, he shot dead 7 men. Further in Abilene, Kansas, his gun took 3 lives. Once again returning to the society as a reformed man after doing his time on the many crimes he committed, he was pardoned and became a lawyer. With such ancient valor, demons didn't leave him behind. In 1895, Hardin was shot dead in a saloon located in El Paso, Texas, which at that time was a crude place. He was fatally shot in the back of the head by John Selman, another figure of law and man with bad character. Despite the fact that it was a mass shooting, people have been unable to determine the motives, some assuming it was an act of revenge, others that it was due to some sort of debts that were unpaid or some past scores that the gunman held against the victims. Despite the ambiguity and violence in John Wesley Hardin's life, his character remains very intriguing and provoking for the people who research Wild West legends. Number 12. The hanging judge Isaac Parker. Isaac Parker, whose nickname was the Hanging Judge, was one of the key personalities of the Old West times. Parker joined the federal bench to become the judge of the Western District of Arkansas at 36 in 1875, which was a very turbulent court in those days filled with corrupt practices and lawlessness. He soon acquired his infamous persona by ordering the execution of a great many prisoners in the colony. The first session of Parker was marked by a tornado-like activity. In the future, he hanged 6 men at once after days which attracted many people from all over. In all the 21 years that he chaired the court, he managed to oversee 13,490 cases, and over 70 men were eventually hanged to death. The Fort Smith courtroom in which the trial took place under the presiding of Parker was not an ordinary court. It frequently focused on crimes in the Indian Territory, an area considered to be a no-go zone for law enforcement since criminals thought that they could not be apprehended there. Parker's deputy marshals, among which were such famous law enforcers as Bass Reeves,
the legendary lawman Bass Reeves.
He was one of the earliest African Americans to serve as a deputy U.S. Marshal west of the Mississippi River.
Pursued these criminals fruitlessly and, with the help of Muggle, managed to catch many of them as well as to bring law and order to the frontier somewhat. Despite the fact that his nickname is the Hanging Judge, Parker is much more than that. He played a key role of a law enforcer in the years following the Civil War, and thus became a significant part of the Wild West's history. Number 11. Helena Duels. Although Helena is a relatively small and abandoned town in Texas today, it was quite famous in the past if considering the Helena duel that was a peculiar kind of fight to the death. Suppose there are 2 people, left hands of which are tied with some rope and each man holding a knife with a blade length of 3 inches at most. This setup was meant so that one blow would not be fatal, and this would turn into a bloody fight of cutting and thrusting until one of them would die. These duels became quite a morbid form of entertainment for the residents of the towns that became a scene for these fights. People would come to watch and place their bets. The scene was triggered by events of 1884 when son of a rancher, William G. Butler, Emmett, was shot dead by a stray bullet having engaged in a fight in the saloon. The shooting was never solved as the townspeople never named the shooter. This made Butler furious and threatened to kill the town that killed my son. Butler indeed delivered the threat by pressuring the San Antonio and Aransas Pass Railway to avoid Helena, and that forced businesses to migrate, and later the county seat was shifted to Kansas City. Loss of its source of revenue, Helena's economy crumbled, and within a few decades the town became a virtual ghost town. The legacy of Helena Duel and the history of its tragic end, without a doubt, will always be one of the most important and rather spiky pages in Texas history. Number 10. The Greenhorns. There are misconceptions of what the Wild West was all about, meaning cowboys and outlaws, but it consisted of many adventurers, mainly the Greenhorns, who were Eastern men who ventured west with a hope of a better life but little knowledge. First of all, the newcomers from the eastern states, especially from cities such as New York and Boston, or even from Europe, were attracted by gold, land, and adventure. But the land was rough, and the life on the frontier was unbearably harsh, which only intensified and turned the dreams into realistic and often brutalist narratives. Just think of it. Have you ever before thought of the idea of moving to a wilderness with no glimpse of an urban world, as these gentlemen and ladies called greenhorns, who could easily be identified by their clean appearance and formal dressing started stock, they had no other option but to start adjusting. Some lacked the basics that included durable clothing, warm cloth, food and water, and more significantly survival kits. However, not all greenhorns fail, and that is still true in the modern world. Many of them settled down and made substantial contributions to the growth of the Western countries. They opened shops, created towns, and were the only sign of some form of civilization in what could be termed the Wild West nowadays. Such characters as Samuel Clemens, or more famously Mark Twain, who up and left for the West and blossomed, are examples of how the Easterner succeeded in the dreadful place. Number 9. The Great Train Robbery. Great Train Robbery is one of the famous stories to come out of the Wild West period. Picture it. It is 1866. The Reno Gang outlaws were credited for what is known as the first peacetime train robbery in the United States. On October 6th in Seymour, Indiana, these reckless robbers stopped the Ohio and Mississippi train to get $13,000 that would be considered as a fortune today. The Reno brothers, Frank, John, Simeon, and William, were especially talented in criminal activities. One day, they genuinely boarded a train, overpowered the guards, and stole the money from the safe, but no one on the train knew anything that had happened. The duo made headlines as their escapade resulted in the emergence of train robbery all over the country. The sequel was a blend of policing difficulties and eye-for-an-eye actions. The Pinkerton detectives whom the railroad companies hired were on the neck of the Reno gang. For Frank Reno and his brothers, their violent demise came either from the bullets of policemen overwhelmed with violence or from ordinary citizens, frustrated with the criminals wanting destruction. What most people do not know is that the Great Train Robbery was not an isolated act, but more of the climax to the modern age of robberies, which endured in legends and lore, fueled the Westerns. It is an epic of heroism and desperate struggles of a man's obsessive desire for vengeance in the wild country of early America. Number 8. The mysterious disappearance of Tombstone Silver. Many claim the history of Tombstone, Arizona is the history of grim showdowns and famous lawmen such as Wyatt Earp. Forced into a factual history, the hope explanation of the discourse can be traced back to the 1880s when Tombstone was an emerging, prosperous boomtown as a result of the rich silver mines in the region. The mines returned millions of dollars worth of silver, which further enticed everyone from prospectors to businessmen to various individuals. However, 20 years later, in the last decades of the 19th century, there was a certain shift. The following is how it looked, and probably the reason as to why the silver seemed to disappear almost as soon as it was being mined. One hypothesis relates the train robbery to natural disasters, floods in 1886 and 1887 that caused a calamity and practically wrecked the mines, therefore making mining a very difficult venture that was not worth the effort, as it was not profitable. It may also be argued that by the time honest leaders or officials realized the accumulation of wealth, corrupt mine owners and managers may have pocketed most of it. There's also a more sinister angle. Others think that the conflict of interests of the mining companies made the competitors destroy the Tombstone mines to control the market. The history gets even spookier with stories of lost treasures of silver, which up till this date have not been traced despite being buried somewhere in the area. Nevertheless, the numerous investigations and raving speculations are unable to define the real fate of Tombstone silver, and thus the matter continues to be one of the many secrets of the Wild West. Number 7. The Camel Corps. During the mid-1800s, the US Army tried one of the oddest yet interesting programs called the Camel Corps. The idea? To serve as pack animals in the dry southwestern United States because it was believed the hardy animals were suitable for life in the desert. An attempt to introduce what is now known to be about 75 camels from the Middle East was first made in 1856 by the Secretary of War Jefferson Davis, who felt that the animals outcompeted horses and mules.
They just aren't horses.
So, yeah, camels in the Old West.
Wages of the camel drivers were also provided through efforts of Major Henry Wayne and High Jolly the camel driver. At first, the camel proved successful. They transported large quantities and distances with less water requirement and negotiated the desert rather well. Nonetheless, many people were not fans of it. The camels were considered very uncooperative, they were known to be stubborn and have a very bad temper. Moreover, the smell they gave off was causing the horses to get spooked. However, the Civil War came shortly after and diverted attention and funding from the Camel Corps, and it was for the most part phased out. They either sold most of the camels, released or set the European camels free to graze in the desert. Although the Camel Corps never became what people expected it to be in terms of revolutionizing transportation, the country used it as the testimony of Americans' readiness to use their imaginative thinking in an attempt to improve things, even if the innovation of the year 1863 meant using camels instead of horses. Number 6. The Herrick Cowboys. Thus, when one mentions cowboys or gunslingers, the mental image that comes to people's mind is a figure such as Wyatt Earp or Billy the Kid. However, the Wild West was the home to many unknown characters such as the Herrick Cowboys. The Herrick Cowboys were crucial in the cattle drives as they not only helped in driving the cattle through, they had to negotiate through rough terrains and extreme weathers. Thus, the term Herrick is not likely to be used to describe hard-working drovers who underwent the everyday drudgery of cowboy life. They were of a mixed lot of African American, Native American, Mexican, and some even the Europeans in search of their slice of this American dream. All the same, they stood discriminated against as well as endured hard conditions, but nonetheless was central to contributing to the Western development. The Herrick Cowboys were good at endurance and skill. They labored day in, day out, rarely getting rest, sleeping wherever they could find space, in the open, and making dangers such as stampedes and cattle theft and everyday affairs. Their working hours were extremely exhausting, but they thoroughly enjoyed the work they did and had strong-knit groups that helped each other. These cowboys did not become the heroes or get the TV shows or the newspaper ink, but they were worth their weight in gold. They were the silent wheels through which the cattle industry and therefore the economy of the West turned. Number 5. Bass Reeves. At the point when you consider cattle rustlers, you envision rough white men riding toward the distant horizon. However, the Wild West was a mixture, and a significant number of its legends were unrecognized figures of different foundations who assumed critical parts in molding the American boondocks. Take Bass Reeves, for instance. Naturally introduced to slavery in 1838, Reeves got through the nationwide conflict and lived with local American clans. He later turned into the primary dark appointee U.S. Marshal west of the Mississippi, catching north of 3,000 hoodlums in his 32-year profession. His bravery and devotion made him one of the best lawmen of his time. Then there's Bill Pickett, an exploring rodeo entertainer known for making bulldogging a method of wrestling steers to the ground. Regardless of racial hindrances, Pickett acquired worldwide acclaim and even turned into the main dark cattle rustler famous actor. Another striking figure is stagecoach Mary Fields. Conceived a slave, she turned into the principal person of color to convey mail in the US. Known for her sturdiness, Mary courageously explored through brutal climate and risky landscape to guarantee her transportation was on time. These cattle rustlers and cowgirls of variety, among others, made a permanent imprint on the West, demonstrating that the account of the American outskirts is basically as different as the actual land. Number 4. The Butch Bandit. Born on August 13th of 1866 as Robert Leroy Parker, Cassidy grew up in the LDS nation of Utah as part of a rather large family. He was inveterate as soon as a sequence of misdeeds beginning with petty theft, yet he before long stepped up his game. He worked with farms and occasionally trainee as a butcher, and from this got the name Butch to show respect to his mentor, Mike Cassidy, a cow's hoodlum. He included Cassidy. Cassidy's largest significant crime was testified to have occurred in 1889 at Telluride, Colorado, where Cassidy and his assistants got away with approximately $2,000 from a bank. This must be obviously the beginning of his unbelievable career as an escapade. Cassidy was not alone in his villainy. He set up for the Wild Pack group. Into them were scandalous members such as the Sundance Youngster, Youngster Curry, and Elsie Lay. Altogether, they performed a progression of trying heists settled mostly on banks and trains in the American West. Nevertheless, Cassidy and his pack was in a position to provide that much, which once more endeavored to catch him by going to far concealed positions such as the opening in the wall in Wyoming and Burglar's Perch in Utah. Cassidy's lawbreaker benefited from, and the constant chase from lawmen made him into an icon. He searched for pardon at a certain point, in any case, negotiating with the legislative leader of Utah, but again his petition was rejected following another robbery. The two, Cassidy and the Sundance Youngster, fled to South America in 1901, where they continued to commit more crime. Their final fate remains uncertain, and conflicting accounts have claimed that they either perished in a shootout in Bolivia or simply continued living as their alter egos. The spirit of Butch Cassidy is still alive, freezing the inventive spirit as one of the key figures of the Old West outlawry. Number 3. The Servant Girl Annihilator. The Servant Girl Annihilator is the name assigned in a historical case of a horribly brutal and unapprehended serial killer in Austin, Texas in 1884 to 1885. This shadowy character is accused of having killed 8 persons, principally young servant girls, thus classified as one of the first serial killers of America. The series of murders started with the murder of 30-year-old Molly Smith, a black servant, and her lover, Walter Spencer, on December 18, 1884. The kind of murder weapon used by the killer was particularly nasty, and victims were often found dragged from their beds, mutilated, and in terrible conditions. The murders were vicious to a level, with extreme head injuries and stab wounds that would leave the victims helpless. The events instilled terror and panic among the people of the rapidly growing city of Austin. Although there were many investigations and several arrests in connection to the case, To this day, the identity of the servant girl annihilator is unknown. Theories have emerged over the years. For example, it has been postulated that the annihilator might have been Jack the Ripper, but this has not found any support. Forensics was not very developed, and conditions which included racism and inefficiency of document management systems did not allow solving the mystery. The so-called servant girl annihilator, with its spree of murders, reminds the 19th century America mysterious and evil. Number 2. Bank robberies. The bank robberies of the Wild West hold a special place in American culture, as these have been portrayed dramatically in most of the movies and novels. It should be noted that bank robberies at the end of the 19th century occurred extremely. For 41 years between 1859 and 1900, only a total of 8 documented cases of bank robberies occurred in the whole of the western frontier. This scarcity is rather peculiar when compared to the portrayal of violent and action-filled scenes seen in the western movies. It is for this reason that such robberies are not very common in a country, because on the one hand there are few banks, and on the other, risking one's life for the purpose is a very serious business. Banks generally had a lot of security, and people very much gathered in defense of their own bank. Another unforgettable and planned robbery of the Wild West was the Dalton gang's attempt at holding up 2 banks in Coffeyville, Kansas in 1892. The Dalton brothers probably wanted to surpass the deeds of the already famous outlaws Jesse James by attempting a daylight robbery. However, the people of the place identified the gang members, and they themselves got armed, and there was a firing encounter. The particular attempt at a robbery ended up in a shallow grave for most of the gang members, including Bob and Grat Dalton, and can be rated as the most stressed criminal plan in the history of these outlaws. Nevertheless, these few inputs have been boosted up through sensationalist portrayals that marked the dime novels and later the visuals served by the Hollywood films. To a certain extent, the popular view of the Wild West is rather distorted, and it was not as dangerous as people describe it to be now. The historical review of social conditions indicated that towns like Dodge City and Abilene had actually lower murder rates than many eastern cities at the same period. Thus, although bank robberies really happened in the Wild West, some of them were conducted with less frequency than is depicted today, and with less style. Thus, it is possible to note that the examples of brave outlaws and dramatic robberies retain audience interest, erasing the distinctions between the actual frontier lifestyle. Number 1. Dirty doves. The term dirty doves is used to refer to female prostitutes. These women's lives are built on physical and social turmoil inherent in the settings that served as the backdrop to their experiences, particularly those entailing risks. As confirmed ladies of the evening, many soiled doves engaged in business in cribs or cribs that were generally squalid shanties and contained individual rooms where the lady of the house and her girls plied their trade. These women, some of whom slept with up to 60 clients a night, were often alcohol and drug dependent, which added to their difficulties. Non-living conditions were so appalling in cribs that women used to stand partly dressed through the windows to attract clients. However, some soiled doves gained fame and at least a certain degree of recognition and admiration among people. For example, Fanny Porter was a famous madame, the owner of a brothel in San Antonio, Texas, who hosted Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. Each location included a pricey, copious drink list, including frozen champagne and silk sheets. Porter's establishment was not the general rough environment of the era. Some of the prostitutes, such as Calamity Jane and Big Nose Kate, were even featured in the stories of the widely celebrated Wild West. Calamity Jane, who was a prostitute, barmaid, cook, and even dancehall girl, if that's what it takes, worked and helped during the smallpox epidemic. Big Nose Kate, who was married to the renowned Doc Holliday, was still in the business after their wedding, underlining the interaction between outlaws and prostitutes in the West. Love remains an issue in these women's complicated lives as they struggle to survive and find meaning in a society that did not value them or offer them much. These are tales of frontier resilience, which were required within the context of the genuinely filthy Wild West. Some of the stories are set in dusty plains where outlaws were identified to have wandered in, and other stories occur in the busy towns where fortunes were won or lost. These stories are witness of the drama of the Wild West. Every story that we have gone through today is not just the story of the great heists that were pulled off, it is the story of the generations and the times that they lived through. These remarkable feats, whether performed by notorious gunmen or ordinary folks caught in extraordinary circumstances, highlight a timeless truth. truth. In the terms of the Wild West, nothing was given, was fixed, and a new episode in the history of Frontier was being written every day. Thank you for coming with us on this tour of 15 strange and influential moments in the formation of the Wild West. So if you like these stories, do not forget to like this video and also subscribe to it, and also share this video to your fellow historians. Leave your comments here and tell us what other aspects of the Wild West you are interested in.